Okay, let's unpack this. Every time you ask a generative AI to write a poem or, render an image of a cat riding a skateboard or whatever, there is a server farm somewhere on Earth burning a little pile of coal.
Yeah. Or gas.
Right. Or it's just drawing down a completely strained electrical grid. We tend to treat artificial intelligence like it's this, I don't know, this invisible, weightless magic that's just happening up in the cloud.
But the cloud is heavy. I mean, it is incredibly physically heavy.
Yeah, exactly. And the artificial intelligence revolution is fundamentally running out of electricity. So what if the savior of the trillion-dollar global AI industry isn't Silicon Valley? What if it's a landlocked developing country in the Himalayas?
Which is just a complete inversion of how we normally view global power, right?
Oh, totally.
We are so conditioned to look at a map and judge a country's potential by, its deep water ports or its petroleum reserves or...
It's manufacturing based?
Yeah, exactly.
Mm-hmm.
And if a country doesn't have those physical assets to just pull out of the dirt or load onto a cargo ship, we tend to write them off.
We do.
But the physical bottlenecks of the 21st century digital economy are changing that map entirely.
Welcome to today's deep dive. If you're the kind of learner who loves looking at the world from an entirely new angle, we have an incredible document on the table today.
It really is fascinating.
We are exploring a highly detailed economic blueprint. It was published in April 2026 on a platform called Democracy for Nepal. The title of the article is Democracy for Nepal: Why Himalayan Compute is More Than a Data Center. It's Nepal's Path to Triple-Digit Growth.
And what's fascinating here is that this isn't just a business pitch for a new tech park.
No, not at all.
The author is laying out a completely new national template for the 21st century. It proposes merging Nepal's massive, historically untapped natural resources, specifically, gravity and water.
Rivers.
Right, rivers. Merging that directly with the explosive, power-hungry needs of the global AI industry. It's essentially a blueprint for bypassing the traditional industrial age entirely.
And whether you're listening to prep for a meeting on global tech trends or, trying to figure out where the AI infrastructure boom is heading, or even if you have literally never once considered the macroeconomics of Nepal, you need to understand the mechanics of this proposal.
Absolutely. Because it applies everywhere.
Right. Because it redefines green energy, it rewrites global supply chains, and it completely shifts what industrialization even looks like in the age of large language models. So let's start with the raw physical asset at the center of this blueprint.
The water.
The water. The article highlights that Nepal has roughly 50,000 megawatts of economically viable hydropower potential.
Which is a staggering number. I mean, to understand the sheer scale of 50,000 megawatts, you really have to look at the geography.
Yeah, paint that picture for us.
Well, you have the highest mountain range on Earth, right? Catching massive amounts of monsoon rain and glacial melt. And all of that water is plunging down into deep river valleys.
So the kinetic energy there is just massive.
It's staggering. That much continuous baseload energy could run entire industrialized nations.
And baseload is the key term here, right?
Yeah, exactly. Because unlike solar or wind, which, fluctuate based on the weather or if it's nighttime, a river flows continuously.
Right.
It provides the stable, unbroken power that heavy industry demands.
Yet, reading the history and the source, the plan to harness that water has been, pretty frustratingly linear for decades.
Oh, very linear.
The traditional strategy has just been build a massive dam, run high-voltage transmission lines through the mountains, and then export that raw electricity across the border to neighboring countries like India.
That is the legacy model. And the author of this blueprint argues it is fundamentally flawed.
Why is that?
Because when you export raw electricity across a border, you are treating your natural resource as a low-value commodity. You are negotiating for pennies per kilowatt hour.
Right.
And you are entirely subjected to the regional political whims of your buyer.
The text uses a brilliant analogy for this. They argue that exporting raw electricity is like selling raw apples at wholesale commodity prices to a foreign trader.
Right. The trader makes all the profit.
Exactly. But selling the digital computing power that is generated by that electricity, that is like taking those apples, processing them in your own factory, and selling premium branded applesauce directly to a consumer.
I love that analogy. It perfectly captures it.
You capture the massive value add of processing the raw material yourself.
It is the defining difference between being a resource extractor and being a value creator. Electricity is no longer the final product here.
It's just the ingredient.
It is merely the input.
Yeah.
The output is compute, the actual processing of data, the mathematical calculations, training the next generation of AI.
So you aren't selling watts.
Right. When you sell compute, you aren't selling watts. You are selling server space, GPU hours, and cloud infrastructure.
And the profit margins transform,
Yeah.
right? From fractions of a cent to astronomical tech industry standards.
Exactly. It's a completely different economic bracket.
Okay, I have to jump in here with a massive reality check. Because I read this and, well, the math makes sense on paper, but the timelines seem completely mismatched.
How so?
Well, building dams and massive hydro infrastructure takes decades, right? You have to pour millions of tons of concrete, bore tunnels through solid rock, deal with brutal weather windows.
It's a massive undertaking, yeah.
Meanwhile, the global AI arms race is happening this very second. So isn't this blueprint suggesting they try to build a surfboard while a tidal wave is already crashing over their heads?
That's a fair point.
I mean, by the time Nepal finishes a dam in, say, 2035, won't Microsoft and Google have already built their data centers in Texas or Sweden?
Well, that exact friction, that timeline mismatch, is actually why so much of Nepal's hydro potential has just sat untouched for so long.
Right, because it takes too long.
Because of the financing. You've hit on the core financing problem of heavy infrastructure. Hydropower stalls because developers refuse to pour billions of dollars of upfront capital into a remote mountain unless they have a guaranteed ironclad long-term buyer for that power.
Which makes sense. You wouldn't build a factory without knowing someone wants to buy the goods.
Right. And in the past, securing that buyer meant spending 10 years negotiating complex cross-border political treaties just to agree on a price.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that's a nightmare.
But the Himalayan Compute model completely circumvents that geopolitical bottleneck.
How, though? Because you still need the billions to build the dam in the first place.
By building a hyperscale compute campus directly adjacent to the hydro plant,
Oh, I see.
you instantly create your own domestic anchor customer. The data center agrees to buy the power before the dam is even built.
Because they're desperate for the energy.
Exactly. Suddenly, the hydropower project becomes immensely bankable to international financiers. Global AI companies who are desperate for clean energy are the ones signing the multi-year power purchase agreements.
So the financing for the dam and the financing for the data center just become one integrated package.
Yes.
Electricity becomes the fuel, compute becomes the export, and the global demand makes the whole thing bankable. So the demand for compute actually subsidizes the construction of the national power grid. That assumes, though, that the global hunger for this premium applesauce is truly bottomless.
It does.
So we need to look at the physical reality of the AI industry to understand why a tech giant would be willing to underwrite a dam in the Himalayas.
We really do. We have to stop viewing AI as just software. The author makes a really profound observation here. AI is a physical industrial revolution disguised as an internet product.
Right. The brain of an AI doesn't just live in the ether.
No, it lives in massive, sprawling warehouses packed with thousands of highly specialized servers.
Let's explain the mechanics of that, actually, because the distinction between traditional computing and AI computing is the whole reason this energy crisis even exists.
Yeah, that's a crucial distinction. With traditional computing like running a spreadsheet or hosting a basic website, your computer uses a central processing unit, a CPU.
Okay.
A CPU is like a very smart professor who can solve one complex problem at a time very quickly.
Right, linear processing.
Exactly. But training an AI model requires processing billions of parameters simultaneously. So the industry shifted to graphics processing units, or GPUs.
How does that differ from the professor?
Think of a GPU not as one smart professor, but as 10,000 middle school math students solving simple problems all at the exact same time.
Ah, I love that.
That parallel processing is what makes AI possible.
But packing tens of thousands of those GPUs into a single room creates a massive physics problem.
Immense heat and a staggering power draw. AI consumes electricity the way 20th century steel mills consumed coal.
There's a stat in the source that really highlights this.
Your IEA one.
Yeah. The source cites this terrifying projection from the International Energy Agency. By 2030, global data center electricity demand could exceed 1,000 terawatt hours.
Which is just a mind-boggling amount of power.
Let's contextualize 1,000 terawatt hours for the listener. That is roughly equivalent to the entire annual energy consumption of a major industrialized nation like Japan.
Just to keep the servers running.
Just for the servers, it's wild.
And this creates the blueprint's central thesis. Compute is the oil of the 21st century.
Right.
Think back to the 1900s. The Gulf states became globally wealthy, not because oil was inherently magical, but because it was the absolute irreplaceable bottleneck for industrialization.
If you didn't have oil, you didn't have an economy.
Exactly. Today, the tech industry has the chips, they have the algorithms, and they have the capital. What they do not have is cheap, reliable power. Energy is the new bottleneck.
So if compute is the new oil and water is the fuel for it, I have to ask the obvious question.
Go for it.
Canada has massive rivers. Brazil has the Amazon. Why can't any country with a waterfall do this? What makes Nepal's geography the winning lottery ticket here?
It's a rare trifecta. First, the hydropower is 100% renewable.
Which is a big deal for PR.
It's critical
Huh.
because tech giants are facing brutal ESG environmental, social, and governance pressures from their shareholders. If a major AI company builds a new data center powered by a coal plant, it destroys their corporate climate pledges.
They desperately need green baseload power.
Yes. And as we discussed, solar panels in the desert don't work for this because the sun goes down, and AI training runs 247.
Right. So that's factor one. What's the second?
Second, Nepal possesses high-altitude, mountainous cool zones. We mentioned the heat generated by those GPUs earlier.
Tens of thousands of middle schoolers sweating in a room.
Exactly. In a traditional data center, cooling the servers often consumes almost as much electricity as running the servers themselves.
Wow. Really?
Yeah, you are running massive industrial air conditioners around the clock.
Yeah.
But by locating these campuses in cold, high-altitude environments, you use ambient air for natural cooling. You drastically slash the energy overhead.
You essentially get half your power bill paid for free by the climate.
Exactly. And the third factor is geographic proximity.
Okay.
Nepal isn't trying to compete with Silicon Valley. They're competing with places like Iceland or Norway, which have used their cold climates and geothermal energy to attract data centers for years.
But Iceland is pretty isolated.
Highly isolated. Nepal, on the other hand, sits directly between the two most massive, rapidly expanding digital markets on Earth, India and China. And it's just a fiber jump away from Southeast Asia.
So if we accept that power and heat are the two massive bottlenecks of the AI revolution, then Nepal's geography suddenly transitions from a developmental hurdle into a massive competitive advantage.
A huge one.
But let's translate that geography into actual human economics. Here's where it gets really interesting to me. How does a server farm alter the trajectory of an entire society?
Well, the author focuses heavily on escaping what they call the remittance trap.
Okay, let's unpack that.
We need to look at the structural difference between one-time revenue and recurring revenue. Currently, Nepal's economy leans heavily on one-time linear transactions.
Like tourism.
Right. A tourist visits, pays a trekking fee, and leaves. Or a worker travels abroad, does physical labor, and sends a remittance check home. It is a transactional one-time flow.
I think the best way to visualize the remittance trap is like carrying water in a sieve.
Oh, that's a good way to put it.
You have incredibly hardworking people leaving Nepal to build infrastructure in places like Dubai or stadiums in Qatar. They do the heavy lifting, but the massive wealth generated by that infrastructure leaks out into the host country's economy.
Exactly. The home country only gets the trickle of the remittance check.
It's a classic brain drain. And it is impossible to build exponential compounding national wealth on a foundation of exported labor.
You just can't. But the Himalayan Compute model essentially turns the nation-state into a massive SaaS business.
Software as a service.
Yes. Instead of a one-time fee for raw electricity, the country earns constant, high-margin, recurring revenue from global tech giants paying rent on cloud infrastructure, month after month, year after year.
And doing so seals the leaky bucket. When you build the infrastructure of the future locally, you completely reverse the gravity of the labor market.
Right. You are no longer exporting your best talent. You are creating global pay-scale jobs at home.
To be clear, though, we aren't just talking about a few security guards and janitors at a data center. Right. Because data centers are notoriously heavily automated.
The data center itself is highly automated, yes. But the ecosystem required to support it is vast.
What kind of jobs are we talking about?
We are talking about fiber optic network engineers, cybersecurity analysts, GPU cluster managers, heavy electrical grid engineers, and cloud architects.
So high-level tech jobs.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It forces a complete upgrade of the domestic educational system to meet that demand. You bring the diaspora back, not out of charity, but because the most lucrative economic opportunities are suddenly located in Kathmandu rather than Doha.
The blueprint actually compares this potential shift to the Estonia Skype moment.
Oh yeah, the Skype comparison is brilliant.
Because before Skype, Estonia was a small, relatively overlooked post-Soviet state. But the creation of Skype proved that world-class disruptive digital innovation could happen there.
It fundamentally changed their national psychology.
It did. It branded Estonia as a premier tech hub, which subsequently birthed a massive, self-sustaining startup ecosystem.
And the author is arguing that Himalayan Compute can provide that exact same proof of possibility. It rebrands Nepal from a developing nation reliant on mountaineering tourism to an indispensable node in the global AI supply chain.
It's branding them as the green AI cloud of Asia.
Exactly.
Okay, I hear the utopian vision. The economics are brilliant in theory.
There's a but coming.
There is a massive but coming. Let's talk about the nightmare of execution. Because a trillion-dollar industry moving at the speed of light is completely incompatible with a notoriously labyrinthine, slow-moving, developing world bureaucracy.
You're not wrong.
I mean, you can have all the freezing air and rushing water on the planet, but if a tech company has to spend 5 years bribing 12 different ministries just to get a permit to lay a fiber optic cable, they're going to pack up and go back to Sweden.
That is the single largest point of failure for this entire blueprint, and the author does not shy away from it at all.
Really, they address the friction head-on.
Yes. The text bluntly states that the barrier isn't a lack of rivers or talent, it is bureaucratic friction. Global capital is ruthlessly impatient. Data centers won't wait years for permits.
So how does the blueprint propose solving a deeply entrenched political culture?
Through a radical restructuring of corporate ownership and governance. The proposal mandates an 80-10-10 equity split for these massive compute campuses.
Break that down for us.
So 80% is owned by private global investors. They bring the necessary billions in capital, the hardware, and the brutal efficiency of international standards.
Okay, that makes sense.
Then 10% is allocated to a poverty-eradicating foundation, which we will dissect shortly. And the final 10% goes directly to the government of Nepal.
And what exactly is the government providing for a 10% stake in a multi-billion-dollar enterprise? Just the land?
They're providing velocity.
Velocity.
In exchange for that equity, the government is required to create a one-desk authority located centrally within the Prime Minister's office.
Just one desk.
This single desk is granted supreme, overriding legal authority to coordinate every single piece of the puzzle. Land acquisition, environmental clearances, tax policy, and fast-track customs for importing sensitive tech hardware.
Wait. I am putting a massive red flag on the play here.
I figured you would.
You are telling me that a single desk, insulated inside the executive office of a developing nation, is going to have total unchecked authority over multi-billion-dollar international tech contracts.
That's the proposal.
That doesn't sound like a streamlined bureaucracy. That sounds like a kleptocrat's dream. It sounds like institutionalizing a massive bribe.
It is the most provocative element of the text, and your reaction is exactly why it requires intense scrutiny. But the author defends this by pointing to the historical realities of rapid modernization.
Like where?
Look at the staggering development of Singapore under Lee Kuan Yew, or the explosive growth of Dubai over the last 30 years.
Those places succeeded because they operated almost like corporations.
Exactly. Investors flocked there because they could get a definitive yes or no from a central authority in weeks, not decades.
So it's about efficiency over democratic process.
The argument here is about aligning financial incentives. In a fractured bureaucracy, every individual ministry acts as a toll booth, extracting minor bribes just to process paperwork.
Right. Death by 1,000 cuts.
By giving the state an actual massive equity stake in the final operating company, the government becomes a true growth partner. Their financial upside is finally tied to the speed and operational success of the data center, rather than the friction of the permitting process.
I see the logic. You make the government a shareholder, so they want the business to open tomorrow.
Exactly.
But how do you prevent the person sitting at that one desk from just, handing the contracts to their brother-in-law's construction firm?
The blueprint demands severe countermeasures to mitigate those corruption risks. The 10% equity is conditional on operating entirely through digitized procurement.
Meaning no paper contracts.
No paper anywhere. Every bid, every land deal, every construction tender must be transparent, trackable, and subject to strict international audit standards demanded by the 80% global ownership.
So the tech giants are basically auditing the government.
The thesis is, you cannot eliminate bureaucracy, but you can hack it by forcefully tying the government's wealth to international corporate transparency.
It is an incredibly high-wire gamble. You are betting that the sheer volume of wealth generated by the AI industry can force a political evolution,
It's a huge bet.
which naturally leads us to the distribution of that wealth. Let's look at the final 10% of that equity pie. The blueprint argues that a tenth of this recurring national wealth machine must go to an independent foundation.
Yes.
And this foundation has one legally binding mandate, providing direct cash transfers to the poorest 20% of the Nepali population.
Which, when you first read that, it sounds like a tech-funded universal basic income experiment.
Well,
Or just massive corporate philanthropy.
right, it sounds like charity, like they're just buying a social license to operate. Here, we'll give you some cash so you don't protest the data center.
But the author frames it purely as macroeconomic strategy. The text explicitly argues against viewing this as charity capitalism or, like, socialism.
Okay, so what's the economic rationale then?
Direct cash transfers are presented as a structural defense mechanism against the resource curse.
We should define the resource curse for the listener because it is the graveyard of so many developing economies.
It really is. The resource curse, or the paradox of plenty, occurs when a country discovers a massive natural resource like oil in Venezuela or Equatorial Guinea.
And suddenly there's a huge influx of cash.
Right, massive foreign capital floods in. But instead of lifting the nation, the wealth is entirely captured by a small political elite or oligarchy. The broader economy actually hollows out, inequality skyrockets, and it almost always leads to severe political instability.
So how does handing out cash to the poorest 20% prevent an oligarchy from forming?
By legally hardwiring the redistribution of wealth into the foundational corporate charter of the industry itself. If 10% of the gross equity is automatically dispersed to the bottom quintile of the population, you bypass the elite capture entirely.
It never even touches the government's hands.
Exactly.
And what does that do to the broader economy? I mean, beyond just the moral good of helping poor people.
The text asserts that extreme poverty is ultimately the most expensive burden a state can carry. It drags down everything.
How so?
It causes severe malnutrition, stunted educational outcomes, massive public health crises, and forces desperate migration. The author writes a line that perfectly encapsulates this. Hunger is the enemy of entrepreneurship.
Wow. Hunger is the enemy of entrepreneurship. That line stopped me in my tracks when I read it.
It's the absolute truth. You cannot build a modern, innovative tech economy if a fifth of your population is waking up every day just trying to secure enough calories to survive.
You're just in survival mode.
Right. When you use direct cash transfers to eliminate that baseline desperation, you aren't just giving a handout. You are instantly creating a stable, domestic consumer base.
People who aren't starving start planning for the future.
Exactly. They repair their homes, they start local businesses, they keep their children in school longer. You raise the economic floor of the entire nation, ensuring the compute boom doesn't just mint a few new billionaires, but actually catalyzes broad societal growth.
Okay, we've explored the raw physics of the water and the servers. We've dissected the corporate governance hack, and we've analyzed the social stabilization strategy.
It's a lot of moving parts.
It really is. But I am still struggling with the physical logistics of pulling this off. We have to talk about geography again, but this time from a geopolitical standpoint.
Right, the neighborhood.
Nepal is sandwiched directly between two massive, incredibly powerful nuclear neighbors, India and China. Historically, that has meant navigating intense, suffocating regional pressures.
It is the defining reality of their foreign policy. You can't ignore it.
But the author argues that in the specific context of the global data economy, this perceived vulnerability being trapped between giants can actually be engineered into a superpower.
Yeah, the text proposes that Nepal position itself as a compute Switzerland.
A neutral data haven.
Precisely. Because we are entering an era where data sovereignty is treated as a matter of hard national security.
Oh, absolutely. Look at the anxiety in the United States over where TikTok stores its user data or Europe's intense GDPR regulations.
Exactly. Western AI companies, Indian tech startups, Chinese enterprises, and Southeast Asian cloud networks all have a mutual, desperate need for places to process and store proprietary data without the constant fear of partisan political interference.
Or sudden tariffs, or espionage.
Right. If an American tech giant builds a massive data center in an adversarial country, their IP is always at risk of being seized.
But if Nepal can credibly establish itself as a truly neutral, legally untouchable green zone, a Switzerland for the digital age, its location goes from being a liability to an incredible asset.
They become the trusted middle ground for the Asian century.
But to be the compute Switzerland, The physical infrastructure has to be absolutely bulletproof, and the logistical to-do list in this blueprint is
And
terrifying.
it's not for the faint of heart.
We are talking about building hyperscale, Tier 3 and Tier 4 data campuses. Let's explain what that actually means, because it's not just a big shed with some laptops in it.
A Tier 4 data center is essentially a technological fortress. It requires 99.995% uptime.
Wait, 99.995%. That leaves almost zero room for error.
That means it can only experience about 26 minutes of downtime in an entire year.
Which means redundancy layered upon redundancy.
Yes, that you cannot just plug it into the local power grid. You need dual independent power feeds from different hydro plants. You need massive arrays of backup generators. You need redundant cooling systems.
And most importantly, to your point about logistics, you need redundant fiber optic backbones. You have to physically connect this landlocked mountain nation to the global internet backbone.
And that is no small feat.
Have you seen the roads in the Himalayas? The idea of laying ultra-sensitive, high-capacity fiber optic cables across mountain passes, subject to landslides and earthquakes, seems like an engineering nightmare.
It is an engineering nightmare. The blueprint calls for routing fiber through mountain corridors into India, north into China, and establishing massive satellite uplinks for further redundancy.
Because compute without flawless, lightning-fast internet bandwidth is essentially a brick.
Exactly. But thinking about those fiber optic cables made me realize something brilliant about this economic model.
What's that?
Historically, being a landlocked country is a geographic death sentence for an economy.
Because you don't have shipping ports.
Right. You are entirely at the mercy of your neighbors to allow your physical goods, your clothing, your agricultural products, to pass through their territory to reach the ocean. You pay massive transit taxes.
But the digital economy operates on different physics.
Yes. With compute, your port is a fiber optic cable. You don't need a fleet of container ships, and you don't need to dredge a deep water harbor.
As the text implies, bandwidth is infinitely cheaper and faster than physical geopolitics.
You bypass the physical borders almost entirely. A landlocked nation can instantly trade with a buyer in London or Tokyo without ever asking their neighbors for permission to use a road.
That realization is the absolute essence of the leapfrog strategy. It frees a nation from the physical constraints that dominated 20th century trade.
And this leads us to the ultimate mechanism of the blueprint, what the author calls the hydro-to-data flywheel.
Walk us through the mechanics of that flywheel. How does it gain momentum?
It requires extreme focus on the initial step. You don't build 10 dams at once. You start by building the first highly targeted compute campus powered by an initial manageable hydro project.
You fight through the bureaucracy using the one desk.
You lay the first redundant fiber lines, and you prove to the world that it works.
You create the proof of concept.
You sell that initial compute capacity to a global tech player. That generates your first stream of high-margin, recurring SaaS revenue.
Okay, so you have cash coming in.
You take that revenue, but more importantly, you leverage the massive international investor confidence that successful project generates, and you use it to finance the next, much larger hydropower project.
Because now you have empirical proof that the anchor customer model is viable in the Himalayas. The risk profile drops off a cliff.
Which allows you to build a massive second compute campus. That attracts foreign direct investment, it creates a gravitational pull for top-tier engineering talent, and it secures more global cloud contracts.
The growth ceases to be incremental.
It becomes an exponential feedback loop. More power equals more compute, which equals more capital, which funds more power.
This is exactly how the author arrives at the provocative title of the article. This is the mathematical path to triple-digit growth.
When a small, developing economy suddenly taps into a trillion-dollar global demand stream, the initial growth phase isn't a gradual slope. It is a rocket launch.
Permanently lifting the entire nation onto a new plateau of prosperity. It really is a stunning, audacious vision. It forces us to completely reevaluate the ingredients for national success in the modern era.
It's no longer about who has the cheapest labor for assembly lines or who has the most oil reserves.
The rules of the game have been rewritten by the AI industry. The new winners will be those who possess the cleanest, most abundant power, the naturally cool environments to sustain the hardware, and the foresight to lay the fiber optic connections.
It's a strategy that allows a nation to look at the sweatshops and heavy manufacturing smog of the 20th century and say, no thanks, we're going to skip that entirely and jump straight into the digital infrastructure of the 21st century.
And if we step back from Nepal specifically and look at the broader implications of this blueprint, it leaves us with a profound and frankly somewhat unsettling realization about the future of the global economy as a whole.
What's the dark side of this equation?
Well, if we accept the premise of this text, that the entire 21st century global economy is becoming entirely dependent on the marriage of vast clean energy and digital compute, what happens to the nations that possess neither?
Oh, wow. Yeah.
If you don't have the rivers, the geothermal vents, or the capital to build advanced infrastructure, where do you fit in? Are we looking at the dawn of a new kind of digital colonialism?
That's a terrifying thought. Will countries without green energy potential become permanently tethered to and economically dependent upon the few compute superpowers of the world?
That is a staggering thought. If compute really is the new oil, then the divide between the compute rich and the compute poor is going to dictate global power dynamics, trade alliances, and wealth distribution in ways we are only just beginning to comprehend.
We started this conversation talking about maps and how we are conditioned to look for physical assets to define wealth. I think it's time we all start looking at a very different kind of map.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the Himalayan Compute Blueprint. Keep questioning the physical realities of the tech you use every day, keep looking for those new maps, and keep exploring the evolving blueprint of our global future.